Session 3 tonight of the new flight plan. We're going to talk about the Pauline principle based on 1 Corinthians 9, basically learning how to contextualize to your particular situation. And of course, the whole issue of contextualization, thinking like a missionary, it's a huge issue, a big topic. Just going to be able to give an overview here. There's lots of resources you can tap into, and with one of the bigger book that I'm facing to change, there's 4 or 5 chapters where I'll deal with that, so you can dig in that a little bit more if you want to. But in 1983, there was an Air Canada Boeing 767, which was a brand new plane at that time, and it was flying between Ottawa and Edmonton. And well before the plane arrived in Edmonton, it ran out of fuel. Both engines shut down. The pilots now had an almost 400,000-pound glider on their hands. And so they had to figure out how to do a successful emergency dead stick landing of a wide-body commercial aircraft. Now, there's several pieces of good news. One is that the captain was also a licensed guider pilot. And 2, they knew that there was an abandoned Air Force base in nearby Gimli, Manitoba. 3rd, the co-pilot had trained with the Canadian Air Force at Gimli Field, so he was familiar with that runway. And the runway at this point was abandoned and only used on weekends as a racing drag strip. Well, to make a long and white-knuckled story short, the crew managed to glide that 767 to Gimli and make a landing. Unfortunately, it was a weekend, so races were going on and cars and people were crowded all up and down the runway. Obviously, since the plane was gliding, no one heard it coming. Fortunately, someone saw the plane, and just like in a movie, people and cars scattered like cockroaches. The plane landed hard, too fast, because there was no power to activate the flaps, control the hydraulics, but the only serious damage was a collapsed nose gear. Only 2 passengers suffered minor injuries. Well, so what happened? How did that happen? How did they end up like this? Well, how in the world could a commercial passenger jet run out of fuel? Well, a simple error in arithmetic conversion. See, the 767 involved a conversion, a switch to the metric system. On this particular flight, the fuel had been measured manually with a special dipstick because the electronic gauging system aboard the plane was not working properly. But in converting the fuel volume from the stick readings into total fuel weight, they always talk about pounds of weight on an airplane, the wrong conversion factors were used. So the result was the pilots thought the figure for fuel weight was in kilograms when it was actually in pounds. Since 1 kilogram equals 2.2 pounds, the plane took off with about half the fuel it should have had. And heads did roll, by the way. Now, the church, your community, facing all kinds of cultural changes, cultural storms. We have to figure out how to respond to these biblically and missionally. We have to understand the current map. We have to know what's happening around us. We have to make flight plan adjustments. The problem with developing a new flight plan is that if you don't have the right information, if you don't understand the situation, if you don't prepare for the flight appropriately, well, you may lose power, find yourself at the controls of an out-of-control plane. We've talked about the map, how it's changed, how to read it. Now, what are some ministry and missional steps we can use to adjust to ever-changing 21st century? Well, first, let's dig a little deeper into the map. I want to talk about the changing fishing pond, our fishing pond. Now, I'm making the assumption we all believe in the Great Commission. That's what we need to be about, is the Great Commission. But here's the challenge. The fishing pond, and I'm going to explain what we mean here, has shrunk. It's changed. Let me explain with 2 bits of statistical data. Per Gallup, in 1948, religious preference, what people stated they were, whether they practiced it or not, whether they, were believers and born-again Christians or not, that's beside the point. But in 1948, 69% of the people claimed to be Protestant. 22% claimed to be Roman Catholic. 9% none or other, Jewish and a few other world religions, and just basically, atheistic, whatever. In 2015, Protestant or Christian, they had changed the terminology a little bit, 47% claimed that preference. Roman Catholic, 23%. Actually went up a little bit, but it didn't go down because of the Hispanic immigration, I believe. Some of you read about the growth of the nuns and the others, 30% in 2015. So that's what Gallup says. Well, the next slide here, David Olson, visual. Look at it visually here. Sometimes some of you are more visual. You see there the pie chart, Protestant 69% in the white, and go to the next chart, the next slide, and you just see how it's gotten smaller. Okay, now David Olson, in a book called The American Church in Crisis, if you haven't read it, you need to read it. It's real good. Because what David Olson does, he said, in his research, he said, I don't really care what people say. I want to know what they do. So he didn't ask about religious preference. He looked at actual church attendance. Well, actual church attendance in 1990, including Roman Catholic in the United States, was 20.4%. Now, at the rate that it's been going, he calculated that by 2020, it's estimated to be 14.7% nationwide, church attendance. At that rate, down to 10% actual church attendance by 2050. And again, so little visuals here, just kind of go through those slides, and you see not in church, the red, go to the next slide, and then the next one, and you just, again, some of you are more visual, you just kind of helps to see it. It's shrinking. Okay, now that's pretty depressing in and of itself. But don't forget all the other encouraging information we've talked about. The influence of postmodernism, even in your own congregation. How about the low percentage of people with a biblical worldview, according to research by George Barna? George Barna says, they did a research and found out that 4% of American adults have a biblical worldview. Now, maybe you say, well, what did they ask them? Maybe they're asking a bunch of doctrinal questions. No, I don't have it here, but if you'll just look on Barna's website and you find this research, look up the definition of biblical worldview. It's pretty basic. I think everybody in here would say, man, that's the minimal. That's the irreducible minimum of a biblical worldview. 4% of American adults have a biblical worldview according to the decisions they make. 9% of self-proclaimed born-again Christian. Now, again, whether they are or not, but people who say, yeah, I'm born again, found that 9% of born-again Christians, American adults, had a biblical worldview. 51% of Protestant pastors have the biblical worldview. Here's the good news. 71% of Southern Baptist Convention pastors have a biblical worldview. Yeah, you're already laughing. What's the bad news? 29% don't. All present company excluded, of course. But what this simply says is, and like I said, this is a pretty basic biblical worldview. It's creeped into our congregations and it's creeped into our pulpits. Now, what does your fishing pond look like? Well, it's certainly different for different regions, states, and cities, but what does it look like in 2015? Well, first thing is the percentage of lostness is increasing significantly. That's bad news, but that's also good news because there's plenty of lost people for you to reach. There's a lot of work to do. There's plenty of work. Not a big problem right there. The fishing pond's actually getting bigger. There are more people to reach. But let me suggest a more realistic 2015 pie. As I was looking through all this research, I started thinking, okay, it's really kind of hard to measure. I mean, who's really a disciple of Jesus? Who's really saved? We kind of have to go what people say and kind of what they do. Okay, actual church attendance is a pretty good thing, but hey, we know there's plenty of lost people in church. And then we probably all know people who don't go to church, but they're saved. And so I started just kind of manipulating, and kind of like Ed Stetzer does, but don't tell him I said that. Oh, we're being recorded. But I kind of took some of that, and the question I asked myself, well, what if I kind of adjusted and said, okay, not everybody who goes to church is a believer, but there's some believers that don't go to church, and I kind of put some information here together. This is not scientific, I admit it. I just kind of put some stuff together, but look at this piece of the pie. In 1948. And what I did is I said, okay, we got born again, saved disciples. Church attenders minus, some percentage of church attenders that are lost, plus some saved, 50%. 50% in 1940. Again, I don't know if that's scientific or not, but probably about 50% of Americans in 1948, Christians, okay? The green, they're open to the gospel. Now, what I mean by that's the synagogue group. They got a background They kind of got some knowledge. You can assume some things. They might go to church. They claim a preference. They kind of sort of accept theoretically, they accept the authority of Scripture. They're kind of that Christianized culture, but they're open to the gospel. A lot of dropouts. That was a lot of the boomers, back when church planting was really getting big 25 years ago. We reached a lot of us boomers that had dropped out. And the red is those that are closed to the gospel. I mean, they're atheists, they're secularized, they're world religions. Now, again, obvious, this is thinking nationally. Bible Belt was different. We know that. All right, go to the next slide. 1990. Saved. Open. Okay, about 50% are cultural Christians, somewhat open. The synagogue, they got some kind of background. Go to the next slide. 2020. What's happening? Look at that closed piece. Go to the next one. 2050. Well, look where we're headed. Okay? Look what's happening right there. You see what's happening. Now, here's the thing. This closed piece. Go ahead, go to the next slide here. What about our changing strategies and methodologies? Now, let me ask some questions and think about this. Where are most of our evangelism, missions, and ministry strategies focused? And when I say we, I'm not talking about you, church planter. I mean we, evangelical churches, Baptist churches. Where are most of our ministries and missions focused? On the red group or the green group? It's not a rhetorical question. Where is it? Where's most of it? I'd say the green group, okay? Now, stick with me here. What theological, religious, church language, customs, rituals, traditions do we assume? Which group is targeted most often by evangelical churches? Think of programs, events, outreach. I mean, you say, we're going for the red group. Well, wait a minute. We're going to have a concert. We're going to have a Easter drama, Christmas drama. We're going to do this. We're going to do that. Nothing wrong with those, but who is it really targeting and who's going to really be paying attention? Those in the red group or those in the green group? Or perhaps those that are already saved. I'm not even talking about those. How well do we really know the lost piece of the pie? Do we even know anybody in the lost piece of the pie? Where are we afraid to go? Again, talk about your average Christian. Where do nice Christians go? And who do nice Christians hang out with? Yeah. Who do we criticize, judge, stereotype? Have I made my point? We got that synagogue green group. We've got that Mars Hill red group that has no background. Now, consider some of the outreach methods, language strategies we used. And again, hear me, I'm going to list some more here. These are not bad, but we fool ourselves. Where do you go to church? What's the assumption there? The assumption is you go to church. You know what church is. You care. Is that a good question to ask a Muslim? Is that a good question to ask somebody who's radically atheistic? Is that good to ask a postmodern who thinks the church is a bunch of pedophile priests? It's not a bad question if you know something, but don't we assume a lot of things? If you were to die tonight and find yourself standing before God and He were to ask you, why should I let you... right? I've used that question many times. I've used it successfully many times. Not bad. But what are the assumptions? You believe in God. You believe in an afterlife. You even care. Now, I'll tell you who this works really well with, people with a Roman Catholic background. I use it with Hispanics all the time. It works great because I know what they're going to tell me. It's going to be a works-oriented response. I mean, I just know. I ask it just because I know what they're going to say, and I just go right on into it. But not a bad thing to do, not a bad question, not a bad approach, but how many assumptions are there? Is that targeting the people in the green group or the red group? The Bible says, well, I believe the Bible says, but again, what are the assumptions? Oh, how about this one? I used to hear this one a lot, especially trying to reach boomers and all the marketing, the mail-outs. Are you tired of boring and irrelevant sermons? Or do you want to hear relevant and applicable sermons? What's the assumption? They want to hear a sermon. They know what a sermon is. They heard a boring sermon at one time. Now, again, 20, 25 years ago, when a lot of church planting was reaching dropout boomers that connected. Does it connect with a postmodern, post-Christian millennial who do you even know what a sermon is? Do you even care? Now, how many of us have this kind of sign? And again, this is not a bad sign. Traditional service at 9:30, contemporary service at 11. Who is that talking to? It's talking to other Christians. You sick and tired of your church? Come over to our church. You know. Now, none of your grandpa's music here. See, this is what my grandpa's music. Now, hear me well. None of these are bad things. None of them, and they still can be used. But have we, and again, I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about we and the big we, have we fooled ourselves into thinking we're really reaching into the radically lost community when we're really just reshuffling the decks by trying to attract other Christians? Have we done that? You know? Invite your friends. That's assuming you have friends. And it's assuming you have lost friends. Now, you make it a job to make lost friends. But how many average church members have? Now, they'll have lost friends at work. But you know what I mean. How many times have you heard this? Or how many times have I heard the next two? People are just not committed anymore. Used to have 3 services a week. Or, man, I've heard this a bunch. I was raised in the church. We were there Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night for visitation, WMU, et cetera, et cetera. That's cultural Christianity. That's when spirituality was measured by how many times you were in the walls of the church doing church work. That was being a good, committed Christian. But how many lost people did you know? What kind of impact did you have in your community? Now that's changing today. But there are a lot of places, especially in the Bible Belt, where that hasn't changed yet. Join us for exhilarating praise and worship. How many times have you seen that advertised? Who's that talking to? Yeah. It's talking to Christians who want more, they want a more exciting experience. Have we fooled ourselves in many ways into thinking that we're reaching into Mars Hill, but we're really reaching into the synagogue? Now, are there lost people in the Greenpeace, in the synagogue group? Certainly. Low-hanging fruit, so to speak? Certainly. But if all of us in the evangelical world are doing these kinds of things over and over again, we're all targeting a shrinking fishing pond and ignoring another one. Not exclusively, not totally, obviously not. And again, I'm preaching to the choir here, I know that. But I make these kind of presentations a lot of times to not the choir, okay? and the aha moment happens. Because we fool ourselves into think we're actually reaching and penetrating lostness when we're just going after the same people everybody else in town is going after. We know that. You know the statistics. New church in town explodes in growth. I mean, I know, I've been working with church planners for a long time. I know, I've done the statistics. I've even checked our own baptisms. New churches do plant. Do baptize more people. I know that. But we still primarily grow by transfer growth. It happens. It's inevitable. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but if that happens in new church plants, what's happening in traditional churches? What's happening in the megachurch? We shall remain nameless because there's many of them. We baptized 2,000 people last year. Well, in raw numbers, that's great. But when you dig a little more into it, 1,500 of those were their own people. Now, they needed to be baptized. But have they fooled themselves into thinking they're penetrating the red when they're really just dipping into the green? Am I overstating my case? Yeah, you can nod yes or no. Okay, but, that's kind of where we are. Now, all right, let's keep going. All these are good. They're not bad. You don't stop them. But they're focused on the synagogue crowd, not the Mars Hill crowd. So how much of what we do, evangelism, missions, ministerial training, even church planning, is too often geared for the synagogue crowd and not the Mars Hill crowd? I've had to deal with it, and I've had people say, "Boy, we need to plant a Baptist church in this community because there's not one." And the thing is, we got to get those people that are Methodists and Nazarenes and all. We got to get them to come into the Baptist church. No idea of kingdom, no idea of penetrating lostness. And a state with two state conventions that's even worse sometimes because we got to plant one of our Baptist churches there. Well, but changing expectations. Once many of us recognize that all this is happening, what do we do short of despairing? Often when we see all this stuff happening, we just go into survival mode. Now, I want to survive. I want to survive as a local church. I want to survive as an association, as a state convention, as a Southern Baptist convention. I want to survive. But I would prefer, however, and I know you would too, that we would thrive. But here's the challenge. What does it mean to thrive in a post-Christian environment? And church planners know exactly what I'm talking about here. How do we measure faithfulness, fruitfulness, and even success? And I suggest we're going to have to really rethink not only what we do, but how we measure success. I don't have an answer for that. But I'm seeing it and I'm preaching it. Ministry and missions, church planting is taking longer, it costs more, and it moves slower. Unfortunately, we, the big we, what I run into, butt my head against the wall many times, we still hold on to some of the old expectations, the same measurements. But it's tough. It's tough. Well, some cultural exegesis and engagement. We know things that have changed. Okay, culture's changed. It's changing. Lostness is only increasing. As a church, we're being pushed further and further to the margins. We live more and more in a post-Christian society, so now what? Well, let me talk first a little bit about the difference between that synagogue approach and a Mars Hill approach. And you're going to look at Acts. And you're going to go through a bunch of passages here, so I'll just kind of read them. You know this. But let's talk about Paul and the synagogue. Some passages from Acts. Acts 13:5. When they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the Jewish synagogue. Acts 13:14. From Perga, they went on to Pisidian Antioch. On the Sabbath, they entered the synagogue and sat down, and then Paul spoke. Acts 14:1. At Iconium, Paul and Barnabas went as usual into the Jewish synagogue. There they spoke so effectively that a great number of Jews and Gentiles believed. And then Acts tells us they did the same in Thessalonica and Berea and Athens and Corinth and Ephesus. Went into the synagogue first. So what are some of the observations? Just briefly, just stating that. What are some observations if we were to spend more time in those Acts passages? Well, one, Paul went into the synagogues first because he had a love for his people and wanted them to be saved. And we know this particularly from Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11. He loved the Jewish people. He loved his people. He wanted them to be saved. So he went to the synagogue first. Second thing we can observe about it is Paul could assume a lot when he entered the synagogue. And again, that's that green piece of the pie. According to Acts 13:14, Acts 17:2, and elsewhere, it says he argued from the Scriptures. He argued from what we would call the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible. He reasoned with them based on the fact that they already had a background. That was, Acts tells us, his custom. According to commentator F.F. Bruce, he says, the preaching of the gospel in synagogues would be largely a matter of expounding the Scripture in terms of their Christian fulfillment. Obviously. Here's what you know, folks. Here's what you've read. Let me tell you what it means now. He could assume a lot, and he could just go from there. It kind of that relatively short distance from one to the other. Now, number three, Paul was also aware of Gentile God-fearers who attended the synagogues. There were a lot of Gentile God-fearers. Where'd they go? They went to the synagogues. So he knew, he was a networker. He knew if I go to the synagogue and I meet these God-fearers, I can meet them, I can connect with them, and then that opens up doors into the Gentile network. Well, we also know, number four, that there was eventually a breach with the synagogue. He left them and said, okay, I'm going to concentrate on reaching Gentiles with the gospel. What are some missiological implications if we say, okay, we saw Paul do that, and we need to keep our eyes on that green piece of the pie. We need to have that synagogue approach. So number one, we don't abandon the synagogue field. Like I said, they're in a sense the first mission field. Some would say they're the harvest field. They're ready. They're often that low-hanging fruit. Number two, however, sometimes they, in the green piece of the pie, have heard the truth, the gospel, so many times it just bounces right off. How many Americans does that apply to? I mean, think about it. How many people have heard it? They've heard it, and they've heard it. Maybe they haven't heard it clearly, but how many people know all they need to know? But they're just not responding in faith, in obedience. Sometimes the synagogue, number three, is composed of cultural believers, and that's as far as they're going to take it. In our case, and what we discover and what we've talked about, many times people are just satisfied with cultural Christianity, and they're not moving past that, no matter what. But as we saw on the chart, number 4, they're more and more in the minority. So where's the mission field? Where's the harvest field? Well, let's look, number 2, at Paul at Mars Hill. Paul in the Mars Hill approach, and you know this passage, Acts 17, 16 through 34, and we won't read that entire passage, but note some interesting words and phrases with some missiological applications. I'll just kind of walk through some of that. Verse 17 says it says that he reasoned in the synagogue as well as in the marketplace day by day. You know, from the beginning, Paul engaged in meaningful conversation. And many of you do that. You've testified. We've seen videos. You know, I get into the marketplace. I got to go out there. I got to go where the people are. You know, so we know Paul sought people out. Paul did not expect the pagan Athenians to come to the synagogue, no matter how cool the band was, or even if there was Starbucks coffee and Krispy Kreme donuts. He did not expect them to come. Why do we? You know, why do we think that if we, now, again, nothing wrong with cool band, Starbucks coffee. I'm not a donut eater, but nothing wrong with all that. There's nothing wrong with being cutting edge and doing good stuff. But do we fool ourselves sometimes in thinking that's going to attract people from that red piece of the pie? Now, what usually happens is we can often point to somebody that it did reach, but the exception proves the rule. If it did reach somebody from the red piece of the pie, it's probably because somebody else brought them, already had a relationship. So therefore, how are we? I have to ask myself this question. And I know I'm preaching to the choir here to a large degree, but how are we going to those third places, even the hostile places, and engaging in conversations? Hard to do. Verse 18, a group began to dispute with him because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. Well, what do we find? What do we observe? That Paul presented the gospel in such a way that it invited discussion. His evangelism, in this case, did not lead to immediate conversion, but it also did not shut down conversation. You know, it invited conversation. Therefore, in our gospel presentations, are we seeking to engage the person, or are we shutting him or her down with a dogmatic, judgmental, condemning attitude? And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir. Speak the truth. Just be careful how you speak it. Verses 22 through 23, Paul says, I walked around and looked carefully at your objects of worship. I even found an altar, to that unknown God. So what do we find there? That Paul intentionally explored, observed, investigated his mission field. Bottom line, he paid attention. He sought information about his opponents before he began his evangelism. Amazing. Paul thought like a missionary. I want to find out who these people are. I want to pay attention. So when I go in, I know who they are and I know how they think. And so he also used a piece of their worldview as a connecting point, as a jumping off point for the gospel. So therefore, we as missionaries need to exegete the culture, exegete the community before we go charging in. We need to find the objects of worship. We need to find the altars. That is, we need to identify the specifics of the culture, the specifics of the religious worldviews of our mission field. How do they think? I mean, what are the worldview, spiritual, religious objects. If you know enough about worldview, you know that so often we deal with surface things, and people can make surface changes, but it doesn't change the deep, who they are deep in their soul, deep in their mind. But we need to really check it out. Verse 23 and forward there, Paul goes on and he says, I'm going to proclaim to you, and then he makes this gospel presentation. Once Paul understood the context, he began to explain the gospel. Therefore, at some point, obviously, the gospel has to be presented. Now, we don't go charging in ignorantly, but we also can't wait till we know everything perfectly. You know, there's a sweet spot in there, you know, and sometimes we go to two extremes. You know, they just charge right in and shove the Bible down their throat. Or you know, I had a conversation with two guys, you know, it says, well, we're playing basketball with these lost guys, and we're going to play, and they're going to see the difference in our lifestyle, and that we don't curse, and that we don't fight with them. And one of these days they're going to ask us why, and we're going to tell them. And so they waited, and they waited. And they waited. You know, at some point, you know, you can't know everything perfectly. You got to move forward. Verse 28. Paul says, as some of your own poets have said. Well, notice here, Paul demonstrated knowledge of, respect for aspects of their hearers' culture. Doesn't mean he accepted it all. Doesn't mean he rejected it all. But he knew where he could make the point of contact, and then would get to the point where there were differences. Because this continued as he was going through the conversation. It gave him connection points to the gospel. So therefore, we should not attack or show disrespect to our hearers' cultures, their beliefs, their traditions, their practices, as disgusting as they may seem to us. The word of the gospel, the Holy Spirit, will deal with that in time. But verses 28 through 31, now Paul moves to the differences. You know, he starts talking about the idol. We should not think, and he says, we should not think, you know, that what I'm telling you is an idol. Gold, stone, wood. We should not think that. And then he goes on and talks about Jesus being raised from the dead. Well, Paul did not shy away from distinctives, from distinctions, from differences between the hearer's worldview and the gospel. Yes, there are bridges, there are connecting points, there are commonalities to be explored. However, more importantly, ultimately, at some point, the differences have to be pointed out. That is, there's a confrontation that has to take place. Now, we can't set and shouldn't set relational evangelism over against confrontational evangelism. Both are needed. Now, by confrontational, I don't mean, you shove it down some people's throat, you're just confronting them. No, I'm not talking about that. But even in relational evangelism, at some point, a confrontation with the person and work of Jesus Christ has to take place. Doesn't mean we're confrontational. But at some point, that person, that hearer, has to be confronted with the truth of the cross. Nice, loving, but there has to be a confrontation with the truth. Therefore, we make sure we know the differences. We can point out the differences and can do that boldly, but with patience and love. Paul did not get ugly. He did not get mad. He did not get insulting, but he didn't back down from the truth either. Well, what happened? Verses 32 through 34. Some sneered, but others said, we want to hear you again on this subject. So a few men, it says, became followers of Paul and believed. What was the response to Paul's gospel presentation? Well, ridicule by some, a willingness to talk further by others. Only a few became followers of Paul and believed. Now notice that Luke doesn't say that they believed and became followers of Jesus or the way. They first connected with Paul, with that missionary. They followed him for a while, and then when he explained what was going on, they became followers of Jesus. Pretty important. And that happens often, is it's that relationship and that trust with the person that's presenting the gospel. Therefore, many will ridicule and reject the gospel and us. Some may be willing to talk or dispute a bit more. The reality, especially in this post-Christian culture, is that more than likely only a few are going to believe. And they may not respond immediately. They may want to, quote, follow us for a while. They may want to get to know us and see how authentic, if we're going to really, just talk it, or are we going to walk it? They're going to follow it. And that's especially true of postmoderns and millennials. How authentic are you? Do you really believe this? Yeah, again, it's kind of frustrating to us sometimes when we think theologically. It's a pragmatic question. They want to see, is this really working? And of course, what we want to say is, well, it's the truth. Well, okay, it may be the truth, but I want to see if it's really working. And they're watching us. They want to check us out first, see if we're for real, see if what we say works. Then they may believe. Well, some practical applications about cultural exegesis. Back in the 90s, I spent a lot of time when I was with Tarrant Baptist Association. I mentioned this earlier, that we had a partnership with the San Francisco Baptist Association. I spent a lot of time in San Francisco. We'd take people there. We had this tremendous ministry experience. And one of the planters in Marin County, Sausalito area, across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco, which is one of the wealthiest counties in the country, and it's basically the headquarters of the New Age movement. Sam Williams, and some of you may know Sam or heard of Sam. He's written a couple of books and so forth. But Sam, he was back 20 years ago. He was pastoring this church that was just always full of seekers. And I mean, they were New Agers, and they were in the gay lifestyle. I mean, they were everything San Francisco was. And he talked about, you just can't make any assumptions. And he worked hard at not making assumptions. But he gave the example one time. He said, I get preached. I gave the sermon, and he was telling a gospel story. And he said, just at the end of the sermon, I just kind of made this in passing throwaway comment. If you want to know more about this story, you can find it in the books of Matthew and Mark. A week later goes by, the next Sunday, a guy comes up to him and says, Pastor Sam, I really enjoyed your talk last week. Again, he didn't know what a sermon was. I enjoyed your talk. And you said something. I really wanted to find out more about it. He said, you said something about finding more about that story in the books of Matthew and Mark. He said, I've been to Barnes and Nobles. I've been to Borders. I can't find any books called Matthew and Mark. He missed the first 35 years of Sunday school. And Sam said it just brought home, in the post-Christian, post-modern, you just can't assume anything. I do it all the time. My wife even gets on to me. Well, you said that, you know about Abraham. How do you know they know about Abraham? I know. Maybe they don't know about Abraham. But we got to know your audience. Well, so practical applications. Number one, don't assume anything about your focus group, your community, your church members, even your own knowledge. Okay, you might get to the point, where you know your people well enough and your community well enough. You can make some safe assumptions, but the point is to be a constant learner. Always be working on learning more about your community, your people group, your city, your state, your country. It's not the one you grew up in. It's not the one you used to live in. It's not the one you went to school in. It's not the same one it was 5 years ago. I mean, just think of the changes in gay marriage in the last 2 or 3 years. I mean, that's how fast things are changing. Number two, work hard at gathering information. Again, I'm preaching to the choir here. You know this. Demographics, research, surveys, windshield surveys, visiting schools. And I always heard, and some of you probably know this, don't talk to the principal, talk to the school counselors. They know what's going on in families and in the communities. Local police, talk to those people. But these are often done at the beginning of a church plant, when you arrive on a church field, but then years go by, community changes, we don't even realize it, and we don't do that anymore. It's changing right under our... You know how it is. It's the old frog in the kettle thing. It's changing so subtly and slowly, we don't realize it. So you got to think like a missionary all the time. Well, I did all that when I planted my church 3 years ago. It's changed. Especially if you're in urbanization, especially if you're in a growing area, it's changing. If you're in a dying area, it's changing. So you got to do the exegesis again and again. Number 3, get out. Get into the community. Go to Starbucks, Dairy Queen, wherever it is your people hang out. Coach a team. Join the Rotarians. Well, I don't want to be a Rotarian. Join the Rotarians. Be a volunteer chaplain. Adopt a school. Get out. Get yourself invited to community events. Go to school dances, even though Baptists don't dance. Well, they did here earlier. Figure out how to start a Bible study in a bar. I know a pastor who did. Now he had his people praying for him and he had a deacon with him. But he started a Bible study in a bar. Dennis Garcia, where are you? Yeah, it was Sam Douglas when he was in Greenville. Yeah, he started it in the bar. Now, it later got him into trouble because he was actually leading those people to Christ, but that's a whole other story. Number 4, listen to people. Obviously, I and most of you, we make our living by talking, right? It's hard for us to listen. And when we are listening, we're preparing the answer, the rebuttal. Anybody want to confess? Come on now. Yeah, we're doing it. We got to learn to listen. Finally, learn all you can about contextualization, which is simply trying to present the supracultural, the transcultural message of the gospel in culturally relevant terms. Now, contextualization is sometimes debated, controversial, misunderstood, but it is biblically sound, historically verified, missiologically necessary. Now, some practical resources. And Scott said he's going to put, I sent some outlines to him, he's going to put them on the convention website, and there's some biblical worldview surveys there, some cultural guideline issues, some articles. There's just a bunch of stuff there that you can download and use, adapt, steal, or just delete, trash, whatever you want to do. But trying to put some resources in your hand, and there's lots of them out there. But obviously there's so much more which we can put into practice. We have one more session left, and I want to come back tomorrow to some foundational biblical issues which should drive all that we do. And I hope those words will be words of encouragement and words of inspiration. Thank you again for your close attention.